B'siyata d'shmaya, we're going to learn Eirovin daf kuf daled. We're going to start from the Mishnah, 5 lines from the top of the Omid. Says the Mishnah, boizkin, which means one's allowed to crush up, to break up melach, some salt, and spread it ala gabe kevesh, on the ramp leading up to the mizbeach in the Beis Hamikdash. Bishvil shelo yachliku, in order that the kohenim going up the ramp should not slip. Umemalin, and one's allowed to fill up water, draw water in the Beis Hamikdash, in the Azara, in the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. There were a couple of wells, of pits. One of them was called Miboyer Hagoyla, the other one was called Miboyer Hagodol. And the way they would draw water was with a begalgal, with a type of a wheel contraption, and that made it much easier to draw water. And in the Beis Hamikdash, they were allowed to draw water from these 2 wells in the confines of the Beis Hamikdash, b'Shabbos, even on Shabbos. Umibe'er hakar or hakir, not so clear how to read this word, but from this well, which was called be'er hakir, which was not in the confines of the Beis Hamikdash, but it was one specific well that we're going to discuss in the Gemara what's unique about it. One was allowed to fill up from this well, b'yom tov, not on Shabbos, but on Yom Tov, they were allowed to fill up water from this well, even though it was using this wheel. Says the Gemara, Romi le Rav Ika mi Pashrunyo le Rava. Rav Ika of Pashrunyo asked Rava a seeming contradiction. Tnan, in our Mishnah we learned, Boizkin melech al gabe akevesh bishvil shelo yachliku. One was allowed to crush up salt and spread it onto the ramp of the, or go leading up to the Mizbeach, in order that they shouldn't slip. B'migdosh in, b'medina loy. We're talking here about the ramp going up to the Mizbeach. So it's clearly a halacha that's unique to the Beis Hamikdash. Uraminu, this seems to contradict a brisa. The brisa says, Chotzer shediskalkel b'meimei gishomim. What happens if you've got, due to the abundance of rain, a courtyard became ruined, it became unusable. Meivi teven, one's allowed to bring straw, umerade bo, and spread out the straw on top of it. And we assume now that spreading out straw in a courtyard is similar to spreading out salt on the ramp of the Mizbeach. And here we see that you're allowed to do that even not in the Mizbeach, and our Mishnah is only talking about the Mizbeach. Answers the Gemara, Shani teven deloi mevatilei, that there's a fundamental difference between salt and straw. Straw, when a person puts straw down, he doesn't intend to abandon it there and leave it there for good. It's going to be animal fodder or wherever it's going to be. He's not putting it there for good, and therefore there's no issue of ashvegumois, of, since it's not becoming an extension, a part of the floor of the ground, there's no issue of smoothing it out, of leveling out the crevices, and therefore it was mutter. However, regarding the salt, where typically they would put the salt on the kevesh, they would be mevatel it there, and being mevatel the salt to the kevesh, that you were allowed to do that in the Beis Hamikdash, but outside the Beis Hamikdash, one's not allowed to put anything down on the ground with the intention of abandoning it there, of leaving it there permanently on Shabbos. Omar le Rav Acha b'rei de Rava le Rav Ashi. Hai melech, this salt that you said that you've put onto the Mizbeach, hey Chadomi, what's it talking about? Ida mevatle, as we just said now, if in the event that when they put the salt on the ramp, it was there with the intentions of abandoning it there and leaving it there for good, we have another issue. It's nothing to do with Shabbos issue, it's kamoisif abinyan. You're adding onto the construction of the Beis Hamikdash, or the parts of the Beis Hamikdash. Uchsivin, it says in the Pasuk, Hakoil bichtov miyad Hashem olai, his skill, koil melachis hatavnis. There's a pasuk that says explicitly that Hashem said, or the Navi said, that Hashem told him exactly how the Beis Hamikdash has to be, what the dimensions are, the sizes and everything, and you were not allowed to add to it. How can you add something with the intentions of abandoning it there and leaving it there? If you're not abandoning the salt on the kevesh, then it's not considered as part of the ramp, and then it's actually a chatzitza, it's actually separation. It's something which is in between the feet of the kohenim and the mizbeach, and you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to have a chatzitza between the kohen and the floor of the floor of the azara or the mizbeach. You're not allowed to have a chatzitza there whilst they're doing an avodah. Answers the Gemara, you're right, that it is a chatzitza, but we don't mind, because the kohanim going up the kevesh, they're not doing an avodah, and therefore it doesn't matter if there's a chatzitza. B'hilochas evorim lekevesh, they was talking about at the time where they were bringing up the limbs of the korban to be put on top of the mizbeach, and the carrying these limbs up the mizbeach is not considered an avodah. It's something that has to be done, but it's not an avodah. D'lav avodah he, and therefore it doesn't matter if there's a chatzitza. Asks the Gemara v'loi, it's not an avodah. V'chsiv, it says in the pasuk, v'akerev ha'kro'ayim yirchatz b'mayim v'hikriv ha'koyin es ha'koil ha'mizbecha oy lahu isherech nechoech l'Hashem. There was something which only the kohen could do. V'hikriv ha'koyin. What was that? V'hikriv. What's v'hikriv? V'omar mar zuhay lochas ivorim lekevesh. Bringing the limbs of the korban up the ramp was called v'hikriv. Was drawing near, was bringing close to the top of the mizbeach. And the pasuk says hakoyin. Only a kohen is allowed to do it. If only a kohen is allowed to do it, it must be considered an avodah. If it's considered an avodah, then how are you allowed to put the salt there? It's going to be a chatzitza. Elo Ema, says the Gemara, you're right. When did they put the salt there? Not when the kohanim were going up with the limbs of the korban, rather by hilochas eitzim lemarocha, when they were carrying the woods up to rearrange the fireplace on top of the mizbeach, and delav avodah, and that's clearly not considered an avodah, and only then they could put the salt onto the ramp in order to stop the kohanim from slipping. And the Maharsha asks here that if we're talking about that the salt is not being abandoned there permanently, then why is it only mutter b'migdosh, not outside the Beis HaMikdash, which was actually the question the Gemara asked before. And the Maharsha explains that even if he's not being mevatel the salt there, nonetheless there's a difference between the way it was done in the Mikdash and the way it was done outside the Beis HaMikdash, as we're about to see that outside the Beis HaMikdash, even regarding the straw that one was allowed to put down in the courtyard, there when you put it down you had to do it with a shinui, not in a usual way. However, in the Beis HaMikdash, when they put the salt there, it was done in a usual way, and that's what's unique, and that's why the Mishnah says, Boizkin melech al gabi kevesh, referring to doing it without a shinui. Let's see the Gemara further. Dorash Rava. This courtyard that became unusable because of the rain, maybe teven, he can bring the straw or meradeba, and he can spread it out in the courtyard. Omalir of popular Rava. Rav Papa says to Rava, is it that straightforward? V'atani, we learnt in a brisa, Kashul Merade, when he spreads out the teven, the straw, Eine Merade, he's not allowed to do it in the way that he always does it in the weekday, and by bringing the teven, bringing the straw, Loi Basel, not in a regular basket, V'loi Bekupa, not in a regular box, Ela Bashule Kupa, you should bring the straw and transport the straw when you're spreading out in the courtyard, on the base, a broken base or a broken section of a box, just so it should be clear it's Shabbos. Be careful, make sure not to be mashve gumois. Obviously there's no mashve gumois with the straw itself because he's not abandoning it there, but he may be mashve gumois on the ground, and therefore be careful, and then it's mutter. So this was a question that Rava just said you're allowed to spread the straw in the courtyard, but what about these conditions we just saw in the brisa? Hada oikim Rava Amoira Oleo v'doirish. Rava appointed a speaker to expound on this halacha, and he told this speaker to convey the following: Dvorim shamarti lifneichem tosein b'yadi. This that I said previously, that you're allowed to just put down and spread out straw in the courtyard, is not completely accurate. Baram kach omru mishum Rabbi Eliezer. What Rabbi Eliezer said was, Keshehu merade, when he spreads out the straw in the courtyard, Einei merade lo besel v'lo bekupa elo b'shulei kupa, he has to do it in an unusual way, not just transporting the straw with a regular box or a regular basket, rather in the base of some box. Continues the Gemara. Memal'in miboyer hagoyla. The Mishnah said that one was allowed to draw water from the boyer hagoyla and the boyer hagodl, which was in the confines of the Beis HaMikdash, even though it was begalgal, they would draw the water with a wheel. They were allowed to do that on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, Ula ikle lebei Rav Menashe. Ula was visiting, he chanced in the home of Menashe. Osahu gavra. This person came, toraf abova, and with his knuckles or with his fist, he banged on the door. Omar, so Ulla said, Man hai, who's this person banging on the door making a sound? Litchol gufei, may his body be desecrated, because he is desecrating Shabbos. He's making a sound. You're not allowed to create a sound on Shabbos. Omalei Rabbah, Rabbah responded and said, no, only a musical tone, the Chachamim said one should not create, one shouldn't make on Shabbos, but just a regular banging noise, there's no problem with doing that on Shabbos. And now we're going to ask a few questions on what Rabbah just said. Eisve Abai, the first question Abai is asking from a brisa. Malin b'dyufi, that if they wanted to get some wine to be poured from one barrel into another barrel, they would use this type of dyufi, which is a tube which has got two mouths, and they would put the one tube into the higher barrel, one into the lower one. They would suck out a little bit from one barrel, and then the water, with by use of gravity, the wine, not the water, the wine would travel and go into the other barrel. You're allowed to do that on Shabbos. Umatifin miyorak l'chayla b'Shabbos. This yarak was a contraption that was actually a container with water. At the base of the container was lots of little holes, but it would be blocked at the top, and since no air could come into the top, none of the water would be released out of the holes. When they wanted to release the water out of the holes, they would open up the top of this contraption, then the air would come in and allow the water to flow from the base of it. They would put a metal container, metal plate or tray underneath this contraption, and then the dripping water from this contraption would make a noise, would make a sound. So it says here that one is allowed to do this, matifin, one's allowed to cause this yorak to drip, l'choyle, if you're doing it for a sick person, b'Shabbos. And then it's mutter. L'choyle in, l'bari lo, you're only allowed to do it for a sick person, not for a healthy person. We'll soon see why the sick person should need this, what it's good for. But you're not allowed to do it for a healthy person. Heichadomi, what are we referring to? Lav, can we not take it for granted that we're talking about denim, that this sick person is sleeping, and he wants us to wake him up, and we don't want to shake him up because he is sick, and shaking him up will not be good for his health. So what did they do? They would release the cap at the top of this contraption, and then the dripping sound of the water would wake up the chayle. Shma mina, what do we see from here? That oiludei kola, to produce a sound, any sound, even though it's not a musical sound, also you're not allowed to do it, because it says you're only allowed to do it for a sick person, not for a well person. Says the Gemara, loy. That's not what the Bryce is talking about. We're talking about the tir, that the sick person is actually awake, and he wants to fall asleep. The mishtama kikola de zimzuma. Then the way they would set up this contraption is that it wouldn't just be a dripping sound, because a person wakes up with an annoying dripping sound, which is a sound but not a musical one. To fall asleep, you need a pleasant musical sound, and they would set it up in a way that when the water would get released, it would be kikola de zimzum, it would be like bells, and that's a musical sound. A musical sound, everybody agrees, you're not allowed to make on Shabbos. Now the Gemara is asking another question against Rabbah. Eisvei, Hamashamer Pireisov Mipnei Oifois. Somebody is guarding his fruits that the birds shouldn't come and peck at them. Udzlov, or his gourds, type of vegetable, he's protecting them Mipnei Achaya, that the wild animals shouldn't destroy them and eat them. Mashamer Kedarki B'Shabbos, he can watch them as he would during the week. There's no malacha involved, he can watch them. Ubilvad, however, that he has to make sure that he's not chasing away the birds or the animals by one of the following. Shelo yisapek, he doesn't clap his hands. V'lo yitapeach, he doesn't beat his chest. V'lo yiraked, he doesn't stamp his feet. Kederach shein oisin b'chol, in the way that he does it during the week. Ma'itama, why should it be also to do these things? Lav, is it not to kamoilit kola? He's producing a sound, even though it's not a musical sound. But you see clearly you're not allowed to produce a sound on Shabbos. V'chol iludei kola, also, to produce any sound on Shabbos is also. Not like Rabbah said, that it's only also if it's a musical sound. Omer Racha Bar Yaakov said, no, The reason he's not allowed to make these sounds is not because of the issue of producing a sound, rather it's a gzeira, it's a preventative measure, shemo yitel tzroir. If you're going to be engaged in chasing away these animals, you may end up taking a pebble, a stone, and throwing it towards them, and carrying or throwing a stone in the Rishus Harabim, and we wanted to avoid that, and therefore the Chachamim said, do not engage in chasing away these animals. Ask the Gemara another question. The women that were used to playing with nuts, also they're not allowed to play with it on Shabbos. What's the reason? Lav, can we not assume the kamoilit kola, that when you throw the nuts and they bang against each other, they make a sound, not a musical sound, but a sound, and it's also on Shabbos. According to Rabbah, what's the issue with making a sound that's not musical? It seems that any production of sound is asur. Says the Gemara, that's not the reason. In order to throw these nuts, this game that they were playing, they would have to level out the ground, and we're afraid that if we allow them to play this game on Shabbos, they're going to level out the crevices in the ground, and that's going to be an issue with boineh. With boineh, with chayrish, depending the sugis we learnt in Masechas Shabbos. If you don't say that the reason is because of smoothing out the crevices, the ashvagumais, and you say it's because of the sound that you're producing, Rav Yehuda said that noshim masachakos betapuchim, also the women that were accustomed to playing with apples, they're not allowed to play on Shabbos. Nuts, when they bang against each other, they create a sound. Apples that bang into each other don't. So what would be the issue? It must be the reason they cannot play these games is because of ashvagumais, and therefore it's not a question against Rabbah. Continues the Gemara. Tanan, we saw in our Mishnah, Memalin miboyer hagoyla umiboyer hagodil begalgal b'Shabbos. We saw in our Mishnah that two of the wells that were in the Beis Hamikdash, one was called Boyer Hagoyla, the other one was called Boyer Hagodol, and they were both operated using a galgal, using some type of a wheel, and it was allowed to be used on Shabbos. Says the Gemara, B'mikdash in, B'medina loy. From the fact that the Mishnah brings the examples of the two wells that were in the Beis Hamikdash, and they were allowed to be used on Shabbos, it would seem that from the Mishnah that only wells in the Beis Hamikdash were allowed to be used using the wheel, but outside the Beis Hamikdash, not. Ma'itama. Can we not assume that the reason is lav mishum del oiludei kola do v'osir? It's because one is producing a sound. This wheel that is drawing the water is clearly making some sound, and one's not allowed to produce any sound on Shabbos. So in the Beis Hamikdash, as with most of the Isurim D'Rabbanan, it was allowed. Outside the Beis Hamikdash, it was not allowed. Says the Gemara, loy, that's not the reason that one is only allowed to use the wells in the Beis Hamikdash, not outside. Rather, gzeira shemo yemale leginose uluchurvosei. Since it's so easy to draw water using the wheel, a person may come to draw water to irrigate his garden, or to put water into his ruin, into his dilapidated building, his churva, and since we're afraid of that, we do not let anybody use or draw any water on Shabbos using the wheel. Ameimer shara lemimla begilgala b'mechayza. Ameimer, he allowed the people in a place called Mechayza to draw water using this wheel. Omar, and he explained as follows: My tamer gozu rabbanon. Why did the Chachamim say one's not allowed to draw water using a wheel on Shabbos? Shema yemali leginose uluchurvasei. Maybe he's going to draw water and irrigate his field and his ruin with it, and you're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. But in this place, Mechayza, loy gina ikar, there are no yards, there are no gardens that anybody would irrigate. V'loy churva ikar, nor are there any dilapidated buildings that people would put water into. And therefore, there's no reason for concern, and he allowed them to do it. Given the kachazar, at some point, Ameimu realized and saw the toruba kisna, they were soaking water. They were soaking, kisna, which is flax. They were soaking it in this water. Even during the week they were soaking it. That means they were using this water for other things other than just drinking the water. And Osar Luhu, and therefore at that point on, he stopped them from drawing this water on Shabbos using the well. Continues the Gemara. Umibe'er hakir. We saw in the Mishnah that there was this well which was called Be'er Hakir. B'Yom Tov they were allowed to draw water from this well on Yom Tov. Says the Gemara, my Be'er Hakir. What is this Hakir? This word, Hey Kuf Reish, Hakir. What does it mean? What is it? What was unique about this well? Omar Shmuel. Shmuel said, Boyer Shehikru Oleo Dvorim Vihitirua. The word hikra is like the word kar comes from the word hikru, which means to call out, an expression. And this was a well where they expressed their words, their arguments, that why they should be allowed to draw water and from this well, using this wheel from this well on Yom Tov v'hitirua, and therefore they allowed it. And we'll soon see in the Gemara that there was one particular well which, when the people came up from the Golus and it was necessary for them to draw water on Yom Tov, and they discussed it and they wavered the Issa D'Rabbanon of not using a wheel to draw water, and they said this particular well will allow them because that's what the time necessitated. Asks the Gemara Meisvei, Loi kol haboirois hakorois hitiru elazu bilvad. There's a brayso that says that there's a number of wells that are all called Be'er Hakar, and only this particular one was allowed to be used on Yom Tov. And asks the Gemara, if you Shmuel are right, that the reason, or that this well was called Be'er Hakar, was because they exclaimed the arguments, they discussed arguments why this particular well should be mutter, then it was only this particular well. There were no other wells that the Chachomim of the time had a necessity to allow them to draw the water from it. So what's the Brisa saying? Loi kol haboiros hakoros. Not all Be'er Hakaros are allowed to be used on Yom Tov. Only this one. There are no others. There was only one that was called Be'er Hakir because that was the one they discussed. All the other wells, they were not given this name. So how do we to understand what Shmuel said? Elozu bilvad. Only this one particular well was called a Be'er Hakir. If the reason it was called this way is because of the words that were spoken on it, maizu bilvad, then why are you saying only this one and not others? There were no others. Ella Omer of Nachman by Yitzchak. Rav Nachman by Yitzchak gives a different explanation. What does it mean, Be'er Hakir? Not like Shmuel. He says Be'er Hakir, the word kir is actually from the word mekir, from an origin, referring to Be'er Mayim Chaim, to a spring, to a well that is flowing water. And anything that's flowing from a source is called a mekir, and therefore Be'er Hakar actually means any well with flowing water. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Kehokir Bayer Meimeo Kain Hekira Ra'osa. In the same way as this fountain, this well, is flowing water, so too the challenges will befall Klal Yisrael. V'gomer, etc. So you see that the word Hekir can mean from a flow, can mean from a source, flowing water. And that's what the Brisa says, that of all the wells that have flowing water going through them, only this one particular one was allowed to be used on Yom Tov. Gufa. And now the Gemara is going to explain the whole Brisa. It's going to tell us the whole Brisa. Loi kol haboiros hakorois heitiru elazu bilvad. Not all the wells that were called Be'er Hakir were allowed to be drawn from on Yom Tov using the wheel, only this one itself. Ukesha'olu b'nei Agolo, when the people from the exile came back to Eretz Yisrael, chonu oleo, they camped around this well. Uneviim shebineim, and the prophets from amongst them, hitiru lehem, they allowed them to draw water from this well using the wheel on Yom Tov. V'lo neviim shebineim elo minig avoisam biyadem. And there's different explanations here. It wasn't just the prophets, or it wasn't the prophecy, or it was just the minig avoisam biyadem, that it was a tradition that they had, that they could use this particular well. And that's the end of this Gemara. And Emir Hashem, in the next shir, even though we're right at the beginning of an Amud base, since the next Mishnah is the Mishnah following up to the end of the Masechta, and there's only a short Daf Kuf Hey, we're going to start the next shir from this Mishnah.